Alright, so the three Revolutionary Alliance of Sahel states leaders just hit Ukraine with the ultimate payback. And let me tell you, Ukraine is really furious. You have the ambassadors from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. They walk right into Russian-occupied Crimea, sit down with Putin's people, and basically gave Ukraine a diplomatic middle finger that the whole world saw. But here's why this is so explosive. This wasn't just some random move. Oh no. This was calculated. This was justice for what Ukraine has been doing across the Sahel. These sabotage operations that have killed dozens of African soldiers and thrown whole regions into chaos. Now, these revolutionary leaders, they've just had enough and they are hitting back right where it hurts the most. Now, let's be real for a second about what actually happened here. When Ukrainian intelligence came out and openly admitted to helping Tuareg rebels massacre about 84 Wagner fighters and 47 Malian soldiers out in the desert, they crossed a line, a very big one. Ukraine didn't just support rebels. They enabled what the AES countries called state-sponsored terrorism in their own land. And Ukrainian officials were so proud of it. They were bragging about it to the international media, calling the men who died Russian war criminals. Well, now the table have completely turned, because Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are accusing Ukraine of supplying drones to insurgent groups, funding operations to destabilize their countries, and working with Western intelligence to keep the Sahel in constant chaos. And these aren't just wide accusations. Ukrainian officials have publicly admitted they were involved in operations that killed African soldiers who were fighting terrorism in their own countries. So when these three revolutionary leaders decide to fly to Crimea and talk about nuclear partnerships, trade deals, and military cooperation with Russia, they weren't just making a diplomatic statement. They were sending a crystal clear message. You want to play dirty in our backyard? We'll return the favor in yours. So in this episode, we are going to dive deep into how this diplomatic earthquake even happened, how Ukraine is reacting to it, and what it all means for the future of Ukraine-Africa relations. Let's get into it. So what do you even call this? You've got three African revolutionary leaders walking into Russian-occupied territory, shaking hands with Putin's officials. Ukraine is screaming betrayal, but for Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they are calling it justice served cold. September 18th, 2025, that day is going to go down in history. It's the day Africa's most fearless leaders taught a masterclass in diplomatic warfare. The ambassadors of the Alliance of Sahel states didn't just visit Crimea. They staged a calculated takedown of Western hypocrisy that sent shockwaves through every Western capital. I mean, just picture it. The three ambassadors from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they stepped off their plane in Crimea, knowing full well that they are about to light a match and start the biggest diplomatic crisis Ukraine has ever faced in Africa. These aren't just diplomats, they were warriors on a mission of revolutionary justice. For 3 days, they were sitting across the table from Sergei Akisonov, the head of Crimea, talking about nuclear partnerships, trade deals, military cooperation. They are touring facilities, shaking hands with Russian officials, basically giving Putin the one thing he's been desperate for a very long time: international recognition of Crimea. The symbolism here is just so cool. It's so good. It's so clear. You have representatives from three nations that have literally thrown off the chains of French colonialism, kicked out Western troops, and decided to forge their own path. And now they are openly defying the entire Western order. Akisonov even praised them, calling them representatives of heroic stakes that challenged neocolonialism and expelled the French. Meanwhile, Ukraine is in full-blown panic mode. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is firing off one furious statement after the other, calling the visit a blatant violation of international law and threatening consequences. They are accusing these African leaders of participating in Russia's colonial campaign, and the irony of that was not lost on anyone. A State Duma deputy, Dmitry Sahelev, he summed it up perfectly. He said, "These are representatives of three heroic states that challenged neocolonialism and expelled the French from their land." See, this wasn't just diplomacy. This was revolution in action. But an earthquake like this doesn't just happen overnight. To really get why these three African nations just delivered this ultimate payback to Ukraine. We need to go back to a massacre in the desert that changed everything. Now, let's rewind a bit to July 27th, 2024. Out in the middle of the scorching Malian desert, a group of Tuareg fighters pulled off something nobody thought was possible. They took out about 84 Wagner fighters and 47 Malian soldiers in one single devastating ambush. And that move, that's what blew the lid off of Ukraine's dirty war in Africa. Now, this wasn't just another skirmish in the Sahel's fight against terrorism. No, this was a precisely coordinated operation that caught some of the most experienced mercenaries in the world completely by surprise. The aftermath was brutal. Bodies in the sand, destroyed vehicles. It was a military disaster that sent shockwaves all the way to Moscow and Bamako. But here's the part the Western media doesn't want to talk about. This wasn't some random rebel victory. Somebody gave these Tuareg fighters exactly what they needed to win. The intelligence, the coordination, the support. It could have only come from a state actor with serious capabilities. The Malian government knew right away that this kind of precision wasn't possible without outside help. These weren't just local insurgents who got lucky. This was a sophisticated military operation. It required inside knowledge of Wagner's movement, tactical support, and real-time intel. And while the Western press was celebrating this as some kind of a blow against Russian influence, the government of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso saw it for exactly what it was: foreign interference in their sovereign business. Someone was using proxy fighters to wage a war on African soil, all to destabilize countries that were finally breaking free from Western control. The scale of this massacre was just unprecedented. Wagner, for all their experience in conflict across Africa and the world, had never taken losses this bad. And let's not forget the 47 Malian soldiers, men fighting to protect their own country from terrorism, who were killed right alongside the Russians. For the alliance of Sahel states, this was never about defending Wagner or Russia. This was about a principle. No foreign power gets to conduct military operation on African soil without permission. They didn't care if it was French troops, American drones, or Ukrainian intelligence. Africa's revolutionary leaders were just done with uninvited interventions. What happened next would expose a whole web of foreign interference that would turn 3 African nations against Ukraine, maybe forever, because someone had been playing a very dangerous game in the Sahel, and they were about to get caught red-handed. Okay, so just 2 days after this massacre, a spokesperson for Ukrainian intelligence, a guy named Andrei Yusov, does something that just blows everyone's mind. He gets in front of the cameras and openly brags about Ukraine's role in the whole thing, in an operation that killed African soldiers on their own soil. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some accidental leak, because on July 27, 2024, Yusov went public on purpose, admitting that Ukraine had provided necessary information to help Tuareg rebels kill, in his words, Russian war criminals. He was proud of it. He wanted the world to know that Ukraine was taking the fight to Russia everywhere, and that included Africa. But here's where Yusuf and his Western backers clearly didn't get. African leaders are not going to sit and be used as pawns in someone else's war. The governments of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso saw this confession for what it was: an admission of state-sponsored terrorism on African soil. Just think about it from their perspective for a second. Ukrainian intelligence just admitted to helping kill 47 Malian soldiers. These were men fighting to protect their own country from insurgents. These weren't Russian war criminals. They were African patriots defending African land. The reaction was immediate and it was devastating. Mali's government acted first. They understood right away that if Ukraine could openly brag about supporting rebels in Mali, they could do it anywhere else in the Sahel. Niger followed right behind them, showing that the alliance of Sahel states was a united front. But the most damning part of Yusuf's confession was what he said about the West strategy in Africa. This was never about fighting terrorism or promoting democracy. This was about using African fighters as proxies in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And they didn't care about the cost to African stability or sovereignty. For revolutionary leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, this was the final straw. It was proof that the West would sacrifice African lives to push their own geopolitical agenda. The same people who lecture about sovereignty and human rights were actively destabilizing their nations. Ukraine thought they were scoring a point against Russia. What they really did was just declare war on 3 African nations that were about to hit back harder than anyone could have imagined. So what happened next? Well, things moved really fast because within just 2 weeks, 2 of these nations do something you almost never see. They completely cut off all diplomatic ties with Ukraine. They called what Kyiv did state-sponsored terrorism. And this was really the start of Africa pulling itself out of these Western proxy wars. Because on August 5th, 2024, Mali was the first to make a move, cutting off all diplomatic relations with Ukraine. This wasn't just a protest. This was a declaration of independence from Western manipulation. Embassies closed. Ambassadors were recalled. All cooperation agreements were torn up immediately. 3 days later, Niger did the exact same thing, showing the world that the alliance of Sahel states moves as one. When one of them faces Western aggression, they all respond together. Burkina Faso, while they didn't formally cut ties, made it clear they stood in complete solidarity with their partners. But this was bigger than just a diplomatic spat. These 3 nations took their case to the very top. They wrote to the UN Security Council with formal accusations of Ukraine supporting terrorism. They demanded that the international community take responsibility for what Ukraine was doing and put a stop to this subversive act that threatened all of Africa. The letter they sent was crystal clear. Ukraine was supporting international terrorism by giving material support to rebel groups fighting against legitimate African governments. This wasn't just talk. It was a formal legal accusation backed up by the Ukrainian officials' own words. For the revolutionary leaders in the Sahel, this moment was everything they had been fighting against. Here you have Ukraine, a country supposedly fighting for its own sovereignty, actively working to undermine African sovereignty by backing rebel groups. The hypocrisy was just staggering. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his fellow revolutionaries saw this as part of a much bigger Western plan to keep Africa unstable and dependent. By supporting insurgents, Ukraine wasn't fighting Russia. They were stopping African nations from getting the stability they need to be truly independent. By cutting ties, they sent a message to the world. Africa's revolutionary government will not put up with foreign interference, no matter which global power is behind it. It doesn't matter if it's French military bases, American drone strikes, or Ukrainian intelligence operations. The era of uninvited interventions in Africa is over. But cutting ties was just one step. These 3 nations were planning something else, something that would shake the international community and give Russia exactly what it had been looking for. Now, you have to understand, because while the West was completely distracted by what was happening inside Ukraine, Putin was playing a different kind of game. He was quietly building this incredible revolutionary partnership with Africa. We are talking about nuclear reactors, military protection, billion-dollar investments, all done in a way that actually respects African sovereignty. This wasn't the old colonial relationship that Africa has had to deal with for centuries. Russia was offering something the West never could: partnership with no strings attached, respect without the lectures, and cooperation without meddling in their internal affairs. The nuclear deals alone are about to completely transform the future of the Sahel. Burkina Faso signed its nuclear deal with Russia in June 2025. Mali signed one the same month, and Niger followed in July. And these aren't just about energy, they are about Africa's technological independence. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso is finally breaking free from energy dependence. I mean, only 20% of its people have access to electricity currently. Russian nuclear tech offers a path to complete energy sovereignty. That's something France never delivered, even after decades of exploitation. Now, the military partnership is just as revolutionary. In August 2025, Russia and the AES signed a defense memorandum that completely changes the game for African security. Russia's African Corps, which replaced Wagner, now works directly under the Russian state, providing legitimate military support for African governments that are fighting terrorism. But what makes this partnership truly revolutionary is the respect for African sovereignty. Unlike Western interventions that come with all these demands for reforms and lectures on human rights, Russia provides security assistance and then lets African leaders govern their own way, based on their own values. The economic side is just as impressive. Russian mining companies have to transfer skills to local workers and give the government an ownership stake in their operations. This is the exact opposite of colonial exploitation. That's technology transfer and wealth sharing. For revolutionary leaders like Traoré, this partnership is everything they've been fighting for. Respect for their sovereignty, cooperation that benefits both sides, and real technology transfer that builds up Africa's own capacity instead of creating dependency. So, with these partnerships locked in, the AES now have everything they needed to deliver the most humiliating blow imaginable to Ukraine's international standing, and they are about to do it in the most symbolic place they could find. Which brings us to September 18th, 2025. This is the big moment. 3 African ambassadors get off a plane in Crimea. They walk right into territory that Ukraine calls occupied, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They were making the biggest statement about sovereignty, self-determination, and revolutionary solidarity that the world has never seen in a long, long time. This wasn't just some diplomatic visit. This was a masterclass in revolutionary politics. By choosing to meet in Crimea, the AES ambassadors were sending multiple messages at once. They were backing Russia's claims to the territory. They were rejecting the West's attempt to isolate Russia. They were showing that Africa's revolutionary government will talk to whoever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want. For 3 days, they were touring facilities, hashing out cooperation agreements, and having talks about nuclear tech, trade, and educational exchanges. Every handshake, every photo, every single meeting was a direct challenge to the West's attempt to control Africa's foreign policy. And the symbolism was perfect. Here you have representatives of 3 nations that kicked out French troops and said no to Western military bases and chose their own partners for development, and now they are openly defying international sanctions. They were showing the world that Africa's revolutionary government refused to be told who they can and cannot talk to. Sergei Askinov, the head of Crimea, gave them a warm and respectful reception. He stressed that the Russia-Africa alliance is main foreign policy direction and said that Crimean business were ready to cooperate with the AES countries. This was a kind of respect and partnership these African leaders never got from the West. Their talks covered everything from nuclear energy to setting up student exchange so AES citizens could study in Crimea. These aren't just empty gestures. These were real partnerships that will actually help Africa develop. Meanwhile, Ukraine's response was just pure panic. Their Ministry of Foreign Affairs was putting out these increasingly desperate statements, threatening consequences and accusing the African leaders of participating in Russian colonial campaigns. The irony was just, you couldn't make this up. The country that admitted to funding terrorism in Africa was now lecturing Africans on international law. But the biggest thing about this visit was what it meant for the future. The AES countries were showing everyone that the era of the West running the show on the world's diplomatic stage is over. And as the news of this visit got out, something amazing happened, or more accurately, something didn't happen. The silence from the West spoke louder than any statement ever could. So now that these 3 African revolutionary nations have publicly embarrassed Ukraine on the world stage and exposed all this Western hypocrisy, the big question isn't just what next for them. But let's be clear about what this really means. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso haven't just chosen Russia over the West. No, they've chosen sovereignty over submission. They've chosen dignity over dependence, and they've chosen revolutionary partnership over colonial exploitation. Ukraine now has a huge choice to make. They can either continue their destructive proxy war in the Sahel and risk turning the entire African continent against them, or they can finally admit that their little African adventure has been a total disaster. But knowing how desperate Ukraine is to keep its international support, they will probably double down on the very things that already cost them 3 key partners. And if Ukraine does choose to escalate, if they send more drones to insurgents, share more intel with separatists, or coordinate more destabilization, they're restarting a continental uprising against Western interference. Every African leader watching this is asking themselves, if Ukraine can destabilize the Sahel today, which one of our nations will be next? The real victory here belongs to revolutionary leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and General Chiani. They have shown that African nations don't need anyone's permission to choose their own partners. They define their own interest or follow their own path to development. They've proven that the era of Western diplomatic blackmail is over. This moment right here is the triumph of real Pan-Africanism over neo-colonial manipulation. So when African leaders can walk into disputed territories, shake hands with global powers, and tell the West to mind its own business, that isn't just diplomacy, that's liberation. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have already shown the world that actions have consequences. Now, if you have watched to this point, this is Frontline Africa. Here we talk about geopolitics from Africa's own point of view. Here we talk about the kind of stories the mainstream media avoid at all costs. Now, what do you think about this visit of the ambassadors of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso to Crimea, a territory Ukraine claims is occupied by Russia? Do you think this is a strategic move, or it's just all about defying Ukraine, or a payback for what Ukraine has been doing in the Sahel for a while now? So drop it in the comment and tell us what you think about this diplomatic statement and message that the AES has just sent to Ukraine and the entire Western powers. Now, if you want to see more of my videos, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.